The museum stood in eerie silence beneath the evening sky. Its glass doors revealed the warmly lit interior, rows of artifacts resting in their displays. Yet, something about the place felt off. Ethan Ward, the museum curator, had been assigned to lead the investigation. Strange reports had been piling up, exhibits shifting, staff resigning unexpectedly. Officially, the museum was closed to the public for maintenance, but internally, it was under scrutiny for the unexplainable occurrences that had been escalating. His gaze drifted to the security monitor. The dagger collection. It had always unsettled him. Now, with fewer people around, the silence in the museum felt heavier, as if the artifacts themselves were waiting for something. The security feed cycled through the museum's rooms. Every display held something unique, yet there was a pattern. Every room contained a dagger, each distinct, yet somehow connected. The footage flickered. For a split second, the artifacts weren't where they should be. In one room, a dagger floated balancing on its tip, utterly defying gravity. Paul, one of the museum's restorers, stood frozen, his breath shallow. He blinked. The dagger hadn't moved, yet it felt closer. Ethan wandered into another display room, drawn to one particular artifact. The dagger inside its case stood on its tip, balancing at an impossible angle. He placed a hand on the glass. The temperature was ice cold. Across the hall, Daniel, the night guard, examined another dagger. It stood on its tip, motionless. He tapped the case. No vibration, no shift. He frowned. Had it always been like this? Michael, a researcher, examined a different case. The dagger was sheathed, giving no indication of its true form. But the longer he stared, the more suffocating the air became. His chest tightened. The next morning, back in his office, Ethan flipped through old acquisition records. The daggers had no clear origin. No shipment logs, no previous owners. It was as if they had always been here. The ink on the pages seemed darker than before.
What do you mean they're gone?
Ethan asked his assistant curator, his voice tight.
Paul, Daniel, and Michael. No one's seen them since last night.
Ethan felt dizzy. A vision overtook him, battlefields stretching endlessly, warriors of different empires raising their weapons. The daggers were there, clutched by kings and warlords, instruments of conquest and sacrifice. On a rooftop overlooking the museum, a girl with long purple hair watched in silence. She had seen it happen before, and she knew Ethan was the last one left. Ethan pushed open the heavy wooden door at the end of the hallway. A strange scent. Earthy, damp, with a trace of something burnt filled the air. Unlike the other pristine display rooms, this one was dimly lit, the glass cases covered in a thin layer of dust. Each pedestal held daggers, their shapes and engravings distinct. But what stood out was the eerie cloth doll placed beside them. It was bound with twine, its hollow button eyes staring blankly ahead. The museum's archives had mentioned them before. Ritual dolls, placed alongside cursed weapons as part of ancient rites. Some cultures believed the dolls absorbed the ill while bound to the blades, acting as vessels to contain their malice. Others saw them as effigies of those sacrificed to empower the weapons. Whatever the case, these dolls and daggers were always displayed together, remnants of civilizations that had long vanished, leaving behind only their silent warnings. As Ethan stepped inside, the door creaked shut behind him. A chill ran down his spine. He wasn't alone. He turned swiftly, but there was no one in sight. Just the dolls. Their hollow button eyes seemed to follow him. His gaze settled on a case at the center of the room. Inside, a dagger stood on its tip, its hilt wrapped in faded, tattered cloth. Beside it, the single doll lay on its back, a smear of dark red staining its chest. A small plaque read, "Malediction Sacrificium." A whispering sound filled the room low, rhythmic chanting. Ethan's heartbeat quickened. He turned, but there was still no one. Just the cases, the dagger, and the doll. The lights flickered. The whispers rose in intensity, voices overlapping in an ancient dialect he couldn't decipher. His fingers trembled as he reached for his phone, but the screen was black. No signal, no power. A sharp clink echoed behind him. Ethan spun around to see one of the display cases now completely shattered on the floor, shards of glass scattered everywhere. The dagger that had once stood inside was gone. Breathing heavily, he backed toward the exit, but his foot hit something soft. Looking down, he found one of the dolls at his feet. A shiver crawled up his spine. Then, from the darkness between the cases, a rasping voice.
You shouldn't be here.
Ethan stumbled into his office, his hands shaking. As the museum's curator, he had spent years cataloging artifacts, but nothing had ever unsettled him like this. He locked the door behind him and rushed to his desk, yanking open a drawer. Inside lay an old parchment, bound with string. He had found it years ago, tucked away in the museum's archives, but never thought much of it until now. With trembling fingers, he untied the string and unfolded the parchment. His breath caught in his throat. Drawings of dolls, daggers, and intricate symbols covered the page. Notes scrawled in faded ink spoke of rituals, curses, and sacrifices. Voodoo. He muttered under his breath. Ancient rites of power spirits bound to steal. His eyes darted to a small paper cutout glued to the page. The aged slip of paper bore a single line in faded ink. Those who touch them vanish because they become part of the curse. Ethan's stomach twisted. The missing men. Had they been claimed by these rituals? The lights in his office flickered. A whisper, distant yet unmistakable, filled the room. The parchment trembled in his grasp. The dolls on his bookshelf tilted, their limbs shifting ever so slightly. His breath came in shallow gasps. The truth had been in front of him all along, buried in forgotten texts. And now, it had found him. A sharp pain flared in Ethan's palm. He flinched, looking down. A strange mark appeared on his palm, resembling an intricate voodoo symbol, as if seared into his skin by an unseen force. The whispering grew louder. The parchment trembled on the desk. The dolls on the shelf creaked as their limbs adjusted, their button eyes fixed on him. Ethan staggered back.
How do I stop it?
You don't.
Panic surged through Ethan as he bolted from his office. His breath came in ragged gasps, his mind racing. There was only one way to stop this. He had to act fast. His feet pounded against the marble floor as he dashed through the dimly lit hallway, his destination clear. The display room. The daggers. He burst into the room, his eyes darting from pedestal to pedestal. There, a dagger, its hilt wrapped in aged leather. He lunged for it, fingers wrapping around the cold steel. The chanting stopped, and then the real horror began. Ethan's breath came in ragged gasps as he held the dagger tightly. His palm burned like fire, the voodoo mark pulsing with an eerie glow. His fingers trembled as he pressed the blade against the cursed symbol. He scraped. Pain. A searing agony shot through his nerves, white-hot and unbearable. He gritted his teeth, biting back a scream. Scrape. The dagger's edge peeled away layers of skin, but the mark remained, deeper now, like it had fused with his very flesh. A guttural cry tore from his throat as he pressed harder. Scrape. Blood welled around the wound, but the mark didn't fade. It only darkened, spreading like ink, etching itself further into his body. Ethan dropped the dagger, his hands shaking violently. The dolls in the room twitched. Their limbs convulsed, their button eyes gleaming with unnatural awareness. One by one, they turned toward him. A deep pressure filled his skull, his vision darkening at the edges. The whispering voices fused into one, a guttural, inhuman growl. Ethan's breath came in shallow gasps. His gaze locked onto the broken display case, where the doll lay half buried in shattered glass. Desperation overtook him. He lunged forward, fingers closing around the cursed figure. With every ounce of strength, he raised the dagger high and tore the doll apart. Fabric ripped, stuffing burst free, and a terrible shriek echoed in his ears. The moment the last piece fell apart, the mark on his palm vanished. His chest heaved. The air grew still. It was never the daggers. They weren't cursed. It had always been the doll. His fingers trembled as he stared at his now unblemished skin. A wave of dizziness crashed over him, his breath catching in his throat. It was over. The nightmare was over. The dagger slipped from his grasp, clattering against the marble floor. He wanted nothing more to do with it. Without looking back, he turned and sprinted for the main entrance, his footsteps echoing through the desolate halls. The museum loomed behind him, its dark corridors swallowing the remnants of what had transpired. As he burst through the doors and into the cold night air, he didn't stop running. He ran until the looming presence of the building was nothing but a memory. And yet, deep inside, he knew some things never truly end. Ethan left the museum that night, but the horror never left him. His hands still trembled, his mind replaying the whispers. The mark was gone, but the scars remained deep, unseen. He had survived, but what if there were more? The nightmares never stopped. Each night, he saw the dolls watching, waiting. The museum was behind him now. He had resigned the very next morning, unable to step foot inside ever again. The artifacts, the halls, the whispers, they had taken too much from him. Yet, as much as he tried to walk away, something in him refused to let go. There were other places, other relics with stories untold. Cursed objects, whispered legends, and the unknown lurking in the shadows. He had uncovered one horror. Perhaps it was his fate to find the others. High above the silent streets, the same lone figure stood on the rooftop, her long purple hair flowing in the night breeze. She never looked away from the museum below, her expression unreadable. She had seen everything. The doll, the curse, the exact moment Ethan severed the unseen chains that bound him. A faint smile ghosted across her lips. "Not bad," she murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. Then, as if she had never been there at all, she vanished into the shadows.